Thank you, Mel. You have not lost touch. You're absolutely in touch. Hey, it's a real privilege to be sharing with you. I saw this week, they broke, actually June 3rd, someone broke the record for the longest sermon ever preached. Do you know how long it was? 96 hours. Someone preached. So we're not getting that this morning, Marty. But it is a real privilege to be able to share in the morning. I usually have our PM crowd, and it is just a real joy to hear these stories of what God's doing, but to come and preach with you. Now, I usually say to our PM crew that I am a Gen Z because I'm born in 96, so I'm right on the borderline, but I'm in the morning, and so I'm a millennial today. And so I want to share a millennial story. So I grew up in the 90s, and I was hanging out at a friend's place and didn't have phones, we didn't have anything, and we were hanging out, we were bored, and so we grabbed our bikes. And, actually, I didn't grab a bike. My friends grabbed a bike. There was a couple of things going on, and we wanted to go to a friend's place, and he confidently said, "It's just around the corner." Confidently. And then so we leave this house, we're running along, we've got the bikes, immediately it starts pouring down rain. So it's now raining, and then again, my friend says, it's been about 5 minutes, he says, it's just around the corner. And I'm like, as each time he said it, I believed him less. And then we had this almost like, it was almost a prophetic moment. I see my mate running in the gutter, and I'm like, it's really slippery, he's just gonna fall over. I was like, mate, don't run in the gutter, you're gonna fall over. Immediately, 2 seconds later, he's like, no, falls over, hurts his back. We're now hobbling through the streets of Bridgeman Downs and McDowell. And I was like, how did we get here? Like, we were dry, we were hanging out inside, and I was like, how did we get here? In this situation, we're lost. We eventually, some say our friends are still out there at the moment, but we did make it back. And I think it's so often in our life, there are so many decisions that we make. In a relationship we have, in a job we find ourselves in. Maybe it's in a difficult situation, you wonder, how did I end up here? I'm experiencing some suffering. Or spiritually, we think, how did we get here? Maybe you're watching online, or you've just walked into church for the first time, and you think, how did I end up in a church? Did I end up in this situation? I want to say you're not alone in that feeling. You're sometimes feeling lost or out of place. And in fact, I was listening to a podcast this week from a man named Mark Sayers. He's a social commentator, but he's a pastor down in Red Church in Melbourne. And he says, he's called it this thing called declinism, okay? I've written it down. It's society is undergoing, okay, or the thought that society is undergoing an inevitable long-term decline along with a feeling of rose-colored glasses for past beauty and freedom. And I don't know if I tell this story of getting lost with some friends in bikes and roaming the neighborhood. I don't know if you go, I just missed that. And sometimes in life, we do the same thing. We think, I just miss and long to not be in this situation that I'm in. And we come as a church to the end of this series called Available for More. And we've looked at a bunch of different stories in the Bible. And we come to the story of this woman named Hadassah, who I think would have been feeling the exact same feeling as lost and maybe confused as to how she ended up in a situation. And so let me just set the scene for you, okay? We're looking at the ancient Persian culture. There should be a photo that comes up behind me with the partying that is going on, okay? So we're in the ancient Persian culture. There is this king by the name of Xerxes, and he hosts this big party. It's 6 months long, 180 days. There's drinking, there's food, and then right at the end, right, this is just pervading their culture. Actually, Tim Keller said this, so I think I'm allowed to say it from a stage too. He said, in the Persian culture, men are judged by the size of their wallets and women by the size of their dress. Okay, so that sets the scene for this culture that we're stepping into today in this story in the book of Esther. And so we get to the end of this party, 180 days, and the king summons the Queen Vashti. And he says, we want you to come out in front of the whole party and parade her around in this kind of this sick way of ending this party. And the queen actually says no. And she embarrasses the king. They actually throw her out of the palace. And then the king, in his great wisdom and misogyny and power-hungry and sex-craved state, says, I have an idea. I'm going to hold a beauty pageant and we're going to pick a better queen. And now I'm not talking like Persia's Next Top Model either of one season. I'm talking years of beauty treatment, years of time. And so we read, actually I don't have my Bible with me there, but I'll read it from the screen for us. So when the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther, so this is Hadassah who I mentioned, so she is a Jew. And she, at the beginning of the story, you can read it. I'd encourage you to read the whole story of Esther. We're just going to look at a little part today. Hadassah changes her name as a Jew to assimilate into Persian culture. And she goes by the name Esther, which means star. But it also sounds like, the Hebrew word also sounds like the Hebrew word for hidden. And so she's hiding and assimilating into the Persian culture. Esther, who was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who's in charge of the harem. And so I want to ask you this, was Esther forced to be there? Esther's an orphan, and this cousin named Mordecai takes her in, looks after her, is investing in her, and then for some reason he sends her into this crazy palace with a king with all this power and money and wealth and this beauty pageant. And I always ask myself, did Esther want to be in this process where she's going through years of beauty treatment? I'm sure there's physical exercise and routine as part of that. Like, did she want that? And so she comes before the king eventually. And then in that moment, the king sees her and makes her queen on the spot. And so here she is, this Jewish woman, hidden in the palace. She's now queen. And I think the story points for us right now. I don't know your story. I don't know what you're feeling at the moment. But the story helps us point towards a hidden God who is working behind the scenes. And the reason I also love Esther, it's my favorite book in the Bible. I actually neglected to say that, so I'm really glad I'm able to preach on it. But it's the favorite book in the Bible. But God is not mentioned. That's not why it's my favorite book. But God's not mentioned, and it helps us as readers to look for God in everyday situations. It helps us to see God in seemingly insignificant scenarios. And the story plays out, okay? So she's now queen. And then this man, Haman, who hates Mordecai, okay, he really just Haman is the king's right-hand man. And he comes before the king and he says, I have an idea. I don't just hate Mordecai so much that I'm going to try and murder and kill him. He puts a stake in the ground saying, I'm going to kill Mordecai on that stake. But he goes to the king and he requests that we kill all the Jews. And he says, there's this date and time that we can do this. And the king agrees to Haman. Mordecai is weeping. He is devastated, and Esther finds out about this. She then requests that and says, why is this happening? And then Mordecai replies with this incredible reply. But before I read it, I want to just say to you right now, your life may seem like you are in the pit. Like you are in a difficult situation, you feel lost, alone, afraid. And there is something I want to encourage you with this morning, is that God is at work in your life and in these small things. Karen Jobes, who's a scholar, said this about Esther: beneath the surface of even seemingly insignificant human decisions and events, an unseen and uncontrollable power is at work and can neither be explained nor prevented. And so Esther is in this really tough spot, and we get this encouragement from Mordecai. This is where we pick up in chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. He sent back this answer: do not think that you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance from the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And he pleads with her to come before the king, which is a crazy request, by the way, from this pseudo-father, because if you approach the king and you weren't summoned, the punishment if the king did not want to see you was death. And so he had to hold out his golden scepter. And so in this crazy story, Esther says this line that I will never forget. And it's such a crazy line. It's like, if I perish, I perish. She goes before the king. And through this crazy story of reversals and giant seesaws, because Esther said yes to God, because she was ready for that call, because she was available, she ends up saving all her people. It's this story of a giant seesaw. It's like this tipping point. And Esther's faced with that choice, and she says yes. And here is the outcome of that. It should come up on the slides behind me, is this tiptoeing of things, the story of reversals. We see what originally Haman had done to try and destroy the Jewish people and mass genocide. They end up being saved. Haman, who was this powerful right-hand man to the king, is then ended up murdered and killed on the same stake that he tried to kill Mordecai on. Mordecai, at some point in the story, is at the king's gates. He's alone, he's afraid, and he hears of this plot to kill the king, and he tells the king, and Mordecai is paraded around as a hero. And all of it hinges in the middle, not only on Esther's availability, but it hinges on God's providence and God's sovereignty in that story. And you can see how excited Esther would have been. Like, I know this psalm wasn't written for it, but I just love the words that Psalm 30 gives for these stories and things when God reverses and seesaws things in our lives. Psalm 30 says this: "You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have loosened my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, that my glory may sing praise and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever." So everything in the story of Esther leads to this point. And I think sometimes in our lives we come to a hinge point. I read something the other day that said if everyone in the world, right, everyone in the world wrote down their problems on a piece of paper, and then they put that piece of paper in a box, would you risk grabbing someone else's box? And you see, Esther was faced with a decision. She could have exchanged her situation. She could have hidden away in the palace. She could have ignored it, tried to run away and save her life, but she didn't exchange her position. And I think the more I read the scriptures is that, yes, not every burden is good, and injustice does need to be opposed, and death is the enemy. But as I look at the Bible and I look at Esther's story, it wasn't someone, like, the Bible doesn't romanticize suffering, it understands it. And it doesn't tell us to try to exchange for someone's seemingly better circumstances. It helps us to be content and to be okay in the situation God has placed us in. And to know that us as a church in Ferny Grove has placed us here for a moment. We are part, Marty said it before, but you all are part of God's story today. I don't know if you've ever realized that. You're part of that. As you gather in community, as you pray. And then I look at Esther, and she pointed towards someone better than herself. The story of Esther points towards Jesus, who in Philippians 2 we read, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he came humbly as a man. He was obedient to his Father, obedient to even death on a cross. And then God exalted him to the highest place, gave him the name that is above every other name, that every knee should bow and every tongue should confess. It's this reversal story. Can you imagine what the disciples would have been thinking in that moment? Can you imagine as they are nailing Jesus to the cross, they are thinking, there is no hope. It's gone. And Jesus very easily could have flicked that switch and exchanged the situation, but he knew when he stepped forward, when he humbly went to the cross, when he humbly took our guilt and our shame and our mess, he took that burden on himself. And he died this sinner's death on the cross so that we could have relationship with our Heavenly Father. And he invites you into his story today. This morning, he invites you to be part of sharing that good news with others. And I tell you what, as I read this story, there is one line that says, deliverance will arise from another way. Like you might perish. Deliverance will come from another way. But I think God has put all of us in this room, in this church, for our suburb, for our city, for our nation. And he invites you into this story. There's that line in Al Pacino's Any Given Sunday speech. He's revving up a football team and he says, it's the guy who's willing to die who will win that inch. And let me tell you, Jesus has won that inch for us. He's conquered sin and death, and there is joy and freedom. And Psalm 30 says he will turn our mourning into dancing, our sorrow into joy. And let me read you a story of when God's people say yes to this. Let me tell you, we stand, church, at a pivotal moment in history where we're seeing redemption take place. We are seeing restoration take place. We are seeing young people step forward and believe in Jesus. We are seeing that of all ages. And as someone who has the privilege of being able to work alongside these people and see this story, do not miss out on an opportunity to be involved in God's plan. I want to tell you this story. We'll wrap up with this story from Gyra Baptist. Now, this man named Thomas Sands, and they gathered this small group of people. In 1861, they approached a man by the name of John Kingsford. He's a rich businessman, and they approached him and said, hey, we want to leave your job and become a pastor of this church. He says yes. He steps into it, and the church, a very small group of people, okay, and they had to raise £2,000, which I looked at, I made some sums, the equivalent of a small group of people raising $600,000. And they raise the money, they open this building with 300 seats, and then they get this verse from God. Right, they've just raised this money, they launch the church, they get this verse from Isaiah 54, chapter 2. It says, lengthen your cords and strengthen your stakes. And God places in them a heart to plant churches. They plant Windsor Road in 1874. They plant Toowong in 1888, Albion in 1882, Nunda in 1888, Norman Park in 1931. And then, you know what sadly happens? Is as people moved out from the suburbs, this is in Queen Street in Brisbane, as people moved out into the suburbs, the church actually folds. But God's plan and God's provision continues to move. You see, the churches that Gyra planted end up planting their own churches. We see Albion Baptist, in 1926, there's City North they plant. Albion also had a plan in planting Stafford Heights Baptist and South Pine Baptist. Nunda Baptist was planted by Banyo Baptist in 1930. Windsor Road then planted Ashgrove Baptist in 1937. And so Gyra's work had multiplied through its daughter and granddaughter churches to include 10 different churches in Brisbane. Ashgrove then planted the Gap. I actually ran out of room, so sorry, the Gap. Yeah, I know, that's Brisbane. Yeah, I ran out of room for the Gap, sorry. We love the Gap. We love the Gap Baptist, okay? Ashgrove planted Brisbane in 1992. Now Gyra had birthed 5 daughter churches, 5 granddaughter churches, and 2 great-granddaughter churches. What an impact in the city of Brisbane. But there's more to the story. In 2005, Brisbane planted an Indigenous church through Billy and Vicky. They plant Dion. And then I think, you guessed it, happens next, 2007, they plant the Grove Baptist Church with Marty and Leanne. That wasn't a photo of the building when we launched, but I'm sure it was in a high school and not as impressive as that. And then in 2013, they plant Hope Community through Dan and Alyssa Perkins. Now Gyra had produced 5 daughter churches, 5 granddaughter churches, 2 great granddaughter churches, and 3 great granddaughter churches. And our story at the Grove is not disconnected from that. We are part of a much bigger story of God's plan and renewal for our city and our nation. And our church family has a family of churches that have been praying and seeking God and giving sacrificially, praying sacrificially, serving sacrificially. And you know, our story began with a promise from Isaiah 54, the next verse, that you will resettle abandoned cities. And this verse set us on a plan to establish a permanent church in these suburbs. And we stand in that building today because of faithful people, because maybe John Kingsford knew the timing of the moment and said yes to God. And so he invites us forward for such a time as this. And so like Esther, we are ready to offer our lives in this moment for the sake of our neighborhood and our nation. To reach teenagers, children, young adults, families, to reach our suburbs. And we've seen the plans of the evil one. I know that there is pain and hurt in this room. We know there's an enemy out there. But Jesus has won the battle for us. And so will your family be available for the calling God has on your life? And so I'm going to get the band to come up, and I'm going to ask something a bit different for us as a church, that if you're ready to say yes to this, we've given our commitment slips, we've pledged that, but as the band plays, I would encourage you, actually you can stand. As we wrap up this service, I'd encourage, we will fill the aisles if we need to, but come forward as a physical response to say yes to God's call on your life. And I don't know what that is. I don't know what that looks like for you, but I believe God has got a plan and a purpose for everyone in this room. Those watching online, there is a plan and a purpose that God wants you to be available for the sharing the good news, for seeing his kingdom go forward. And I pray that people would see your good deeds and that they would glorify our Father in heaven. And then I'm going to just pray over us after that. So an Esther story really is being written again today in 2026, and the time of turnaround is near. Let me pray. God, we thank you for your word today. We thank you for the story of Esther, and we thank you for the good news and gospel of Jesus, and we thank you for many faithful people who have gone before us and said yes to you. Because this isn't about one church, this isn't about us glorifying ourselves. It is us, a people who know the moment that we have been called for such a time as this. And so, God, I pray as we step forward into this next season, God, would we take ground not by striving or trying to remove circumstances or exchange circumstances, but by trusting you, the sovereign God who provides everything we need. In Jesus' name, amen.